Hi, Marcos.
Hello, Robert. It's a great pleasure to see you. Oh, come on. It's a great pleasure to see you. How are you?
Yes, we finally meet, even though in digital space. Yeah.
Let's begin. Isa, tá me ouvindo? Ok. Pessoal, por favor, feche os microfones para a gente poder começar. Vamos lá. Queria agradecer novamente a presença de todos para mais um evento do Teatros, oficina de imaginação compartilhada. Hoje a gente vai ter o imenso prazer de receber Robert Romanyshyn. Robert, é um grande prazer conhecê-lo pessoalmente e virtualmente. Sou um leitor assíduo da sua obra há muitos anos. Lu, escreve se pode fechar o microfone, por favor.
Marcus?
Ok, podemos continuar?
There's an echo feedback and it makes it hard to understand.
Está te ouvindo? Isa, ele está ouvindo? Ok? É um prazer te receber, Robert. Há muitos anos que eu venho lendo a sua obra e a oportunidade de trazer você para falar para a nossa comunidade junguiana é uma oportunidade bastante peculiar. Então, espero que você goste, se sinta à vontade. Eu vou te apresentar para o nosso público. Robert é professor da Pacífica Graduate, autor de vários livros. Queria mostrar alguns livros do Robert. Tecnologia, Sintoma e Sonho. The Ways of the Heart, belíssimo livro de ensaios sobre uma psicologia imaginal. Uma obra clássica do Round Researcher. E o último, Victor Frankenstein e as sombras da tecnologia. Robert, um prazer te receber. Fique à vontade. Espero que para você seja tão prazeroso quanto nós acreditamos que será para nós. Seja bem-vindo.
Thank you very much, Marcos, for the invitation. I was first intrigued when I received your email, and then I was very excited to be able to participate with your group. I went online and discovered many good things about it, and I am very happy to be here and look forward very much to sharing the evening with all of you. Thank you again for the invitation.
Prazer é nosso.
Ready to go?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, when Marcos, when you asked me to participate, you mentioned that you were interested in the way that I have. I'm still getting a feedback in the mic. Is that? Yeah, okay. There's like an echo coming back. You asked me if I could talk about the way in which over the last, from my life in psychology, etc., and the work I've done, the dialogue that has been very important to me between phenomenology and both phenomenological philosophy and psychology, and Jungian archetypal psychology, depth psychology in general, but particularly Jung's work and the archetypal perspective that he brings in the way it's been elaborated by James Hillman. That dialogue between those two great traditions and my turn to the poets. And that is what I wanted to speak to tonight. It is something I've been engaged in all my life. So to begin, you know, now we are living at a moment in human history. Every day when you turn on the news, it is one almost unspeakable crisis after another, both politically, economically, but especially what concerns me is the ecological crisis we face. And that for me is the singular overriding question today. And I would put it very starkly. How much time might we have left on this planet? Even at the peak of the nuclear crisis in the 1980s, when I was teaching at the University of Dallas in the graduate program that I helped found there, even then, there was the sense that we might be facing nuclear disaster, Holocaust. Because at that time, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists had set the doomsday clock, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. They said it's 2 minutes to midnight. But there was still some feeling that such specieside, as I would call it, others have called it that, ecocide, ecological suicide, that would not be allowed to happen. That we would pull away from the brink of our own self-destruction, that the path towards a nuclear winter, which seemed imminent at times, was not yet irreversible. But recently, I think within the last 2 months perhaps, the doomsday clock has advanced, and this is shocking, to 100 seconds before midnight. Imagine that. And in another series of webinars that I have been doing for a young group based in the United States, I said, how do we imagine living in the shadow of maybe 100 seconds before midnight, before tremendous destruction worldwide? And I use the analogy of when the Enola Gay, the American airplane that carried the bomb load to drop on Hiroshima. The people living in the city then, of course, did not know that they had 100 seconds before a most unspeakable, horrible disaster was about to be visited upon them. And in that talk, I stopped talking for 100 seconds and asked people to contemplate. If you knew that these are your last 100 seconds, what would you do with your life? I mean, I tried to really make it experiential. Because while the doomsday clock is a metaphor for the disaster that can happen, it is still a very powerful way in which we can experience the kind of ecological train wreck that is fast approaching. Our ability to reverse global warming and its consequences, I think, is now more in question than it ever has been, and perhaps even our ability to slow the process down. In his dialogues with Wolfgang Pauli, Jung's psychology and quantum physics meet at the psychoid level of unconscious dynamics. to me, that dialogue, and that ongoing conversation between Jung and Pauli, where that whole notion of the psychoid archetype was described, to me, that is one of the most important insights of the 20th century. Why? Because the way that I read that dialogue between the two, in that wonderful book, Adam and Archetype, that at that level of unconscious dynamics, the deeper one penetrates into the depths of nature in the discipline of physics, one encounters psyche. And the reciprocal, or the other side of that, is that the deeper one explores psyche, one encounters nature. Now, there are several radical implications of this remarkable insight, at least in terms of the way that I've come to understand it. So let me mention 4 of them. The psychoid archetype is one, or first, the spirit of the anima mundi, the soul of the world, rising up from the depths, awakening the collective global psyche in all of us. 2, the psychoid archetype is nature becoming aware of itself through us. To me, that's a very important point. The American physicist Archibald Wheeler, in the 50s, I believe it was, wrote that it is through human consciousness, he wasn't speaking about the unconscious, so I'm adding that depth and that dimension, is the way psyche continues to create itself, come to know itself. And then, of course, you know, you have Maria Louise von Franz, who also understands that and sees the darker shadow in that. Because maybe, she says, we've been a mistake on the part of nature. If we allow ourselves to think outside the box a bit in this way, if we are indeed the agents in service of consciousness continuing to create itself and to know itself, maybe that's been a failed experiment on the part of nature. The way von Franz puts it is exactly like that. Consciousness might be a mistake with all of its blather, she says. And if that's the case, if we are part of that kind of cosmological, evolutionary, continuing expansion of consciousness, including its dark shadows into nature, and if we have forgotten that we are agents in service to that, and believe ourselves now from the point of the ego to be the ones who are directing it, then we are believing ourselves as author and forgetting that we are part of nature and think ourselves as being apart from it. And for me, that is one of the dangers in the work that I've been doing on technology, that we see ourselves as masters and lords of creation and forget that our roots, particularly at this psychoid level of the archetype, lie within nature. And again, that's why for me, Jung psychology today, even more than in its practice as a therapy, which I think is incredibly helpful. I could not be where I am today without the years of Jungian analysis, which my wife and I continue to do. She is also a Jungian scholar and has practiced a Jungian analytic form of psychotherapy. So I believe that Jung's psychology then is really badly needed. And that was one of the reasons why I was very happy to be invited to this gathering tonight. Third point then, the psychoid archetype is not only nature becoming aware of itself through us, but it is the consciousness of nature in us. The place where we are, green, wind, star, animal, storm. At that deepest level, when you penetrate into this psychoid level of the archetype, which for me is one of the 4 levels that the 20th century has explored and excavated, the first being with the Freudian personal level and the familial personal historical level, and then phenomenology with the cultural historical level of unconscious dynamics, and then Jung with the archetypal dimension or the collective, and then finally the psychoid level of the archetype. You know, but at that level, that's where you really tap into, we are green, we are wind, we are animal, we are star. It comes in our dreams. And in fact, I'll get to that. To me, that's had a profound effect on the way that I've come to understand dreams and work with them over the years. But I think the one place, at least in my life and what I've seen in the past with some patients, in my own life, it was the unexpected loss, death of my first wife, and the real descent that I fell into after that sudden, unexpected death. In front of me, after 24 years of marriage, one day we were in the same room and she died within 20 seconds. I descended into the winter of the soul. And I can remember, and I wrote about it in the book 7, 8 years later, The Soul in Grief, Love, Death, and Transformation. I remembered when that grieving process began to melt the winter ice around my heart and soul. It was a Sunday, and I had finished teaching a class at Pacifica Graduate Institute. And I was still pretty much silent and trying to find my way, still pretty much lost. But I sat on this bench, and it was about 5:30 in the afternoon. And the sun was still, its beautiful early autumn color. And there was a green hill about 300 yards in front of me, the bench where I was sitting. And I suddenly was bathed in waves of green that began to wash from the hill over me. And I felt green in my consciousness. And then I did some subsequent investigations of the Green Man image and discovered that it is possible to say that the spectral colors that we know about, and Jung has written about this, also operate in the soul. There is the infrared instinctual and the ultraviolet spiritual. But if you look at I might be going off the track here a bit, but I've got to say this. If you look at the spectrum, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Green anchors both the ultraviolet and the infrared colors of the spectrum. So I began to wonder, is green the first color of consciousness? Is green the first color of consciousness even at the human level? So that's what I mean by that third point. The psychoid archetype is the consciousness of nature in us, the place where we are, those elements. And that, by the way, has led me to think about what does it mean then to think about psychology as an elemental psychology. To write a psychology, to think about a psychology, to be with our patients, to attend to our dreams in terms of the seasons of the soul. And as a by the way, one of the poets who has definitely influenced me is Wallace Stevens, because he writes about the seasons of nature and having a complement in the seasons of the human psyche. So now, the fourth, the psychoid archetype then, given the other three I said, I've come to believe that in our practice and in the way that we live every day, individually, outside the therapy room, in our relationships with those whom we love, that we try to practice as best as possible that we are all together ensorcelled, wrapped within the natural world, and can, if we attend to the beauty, the wonder, the marvel, the mystery, the seduction, the everyday appeals of nature that can stop you in your tracks. Children know this. I've spent marvelous times with my grandson before he was about 5 with him. The wonder of nature still, that lives in all of us. So if we can resurrect that somehow and be reminded that the psychoid nature of the archetype is psychologically where we are nature, and nature is psychological, maybe that's then our last and best hope to restore the broken bonds between us and the natural world. 100 seconds to midnight. A pivotal crisis moment of danger and opportunity is now upon us. And as the philosopher Martin Heidegger has noted, and I love his phrase, the gods have fled and we are in the midnight of the world. That's what he says. The gods have fled and we are in the midnight of the world. I've learned a lot from Heidegger's work. Not as much perhaps as from the work of Merleau-Ponty, and I'll get into that later. But I always wondered, where have the gods gone? Not only that, but what has motivated them taking leave of us? And that has influenced some of my dreams. I work with a dream group. My wife and I have been doing it for the last 4 years with 6 other people, 5 other people, some from New Zealand, some from the States. And my own dreams recently have really built on this sense that the gods, where have they gone? What has motivated their departure? I had one dream is where they said that we have done an experiment and we failed. This was pretty pessimistic, and so we are taking our leave. I took that, of course, personally, but also then objectively. What is it saying on a larger scale? And then that was followed by another powerful dream within the next few nights of where I was sitting by a tree, and it was an oak tree, powerful, and how powerful oak trees are in myth and lore. And I noticed there was soft green grass, and I started to rub my hand on that grass. And all of a sudden, a huge light, a golden light, broke through the ground. And I saw below these gremlin-like figures making gold. So I thought that that also fit with the first dream. And I've been working with that, working with colleagues and friends and trying to live into both of those dreams. So this pivotal crisis, as Heidegger has noted, the gods have fled. But then Jung has also given us his sense of where they have taken up their habitation. And I just think this is brilliant. He said the gods have become our diseases. Imagine that. They are traces and shadows haunting us as collective global symptoms, personal symptoms as well, but collective global symptoms of ecological disasters, institutional structures breaking down, and most vividly now, the global pandemic of COVID-19. I'm trying to work on a series of blogs on looking at COVID-19 from its point of view as a symptom, calling us to remember something that we are forgetting. But given that the gods have fled and they have taken up maybe their residence in us as our diseases, the question then that comes for me, and that I would like to throw out to all of you to maybe for discussion, how do we as workers in the depths of psyche make ourselves ready for this crisis moment? How do we do that? What do we do? And then, as James Hillman has noted, he says we follow the symptom. And why do that? Why attend to the symptom and not erase it? I mean, we live in a culture which overly medicalizes the symptom, sees it as something to be gotten rid of, a negative sign attached to it. But all the work I've ever done with patients, it's always convinced me, because in all the years of practice that I've done, I've come to appreciate with my patients, and particularly in my own life, that the symptom is a vocation, a calling to hold attention between remembering something too vital to forget, while forgetting it because it is too painful to remember. So as best as I can in my work as a therapist over many, many years, and in teaching graduate students in Jungian depth psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute, I always start with taking the side of the symptom and asking the question, who is in the symptom? When the person comes into therapy, I learned, and I learned this from working with actors, actually, stage people, a difference. And I would tell my students, don't make the mistake of identifying the person who comes into therapy for therapy, or comes to therapy, the person. Don't identify that with the figures who come for therapy. Try to listen to the story of the figures there. What do they want? They carry the tale. The way they speak and their gestures and their sufferings. Listen attentively to that. It's listening on the margins. So I want to suggest extending that kind of way of dealing with the symptom. I want to suggest that the global crisis we face today are calling us to remember that if and when we regard the world as the veil of soul making, as the poet John Keats said, we recover the aesthetic life of soul as the foundation for the poetic realism of the world. And that's my major point tonight, I think, or one of them. If we start with the poets, and I choose this phrase from Keats, let's call the world the veil of soul making. That's soul making, soul life is done by being there, risking oneself into the fullness of life. Not being so terribly cautious all the time. Following some of the fantasies or impulses or dreams or symptoms that make their suggestion and call us to attend to something. That if that's the case, if the world then and living life is the veil of soul making, that's where in recovering the aesthetic life of soul, and I'll get back to what I mean by that, the aesthetic life of soul, or maybe I should say that here, I mean aesthetic in its root sense as feeling, rather than the benumbed life, being numbed in the kind of culture we live in. And we capture the real sense of aesthetic, not just as something that is beauty or beautiful or a trinket, although beauty is very important to awakening the soul. Take that from Plato. But aesthetic in its root sense is feeling. And you capture it when you negate the word anesthetic, like in surgery or medical conditions. So to recover the aesthetic life of soul is to recover the feeling function in the world as the veil of soul making. And then the point I want to make is we discover that at that place where we are nature and nature is one, we are deeper than empirical realism. We are in the poetic realism of the world. And I have to make that a little bit clear today. So I hope I can do it without too much of using too much jargon. So I'm going to go to describe this poetic realism in the world by just mentioning a story that I'm sure we're all familiar with, and that was a favorite of Jung's. It's the story of the Rainmaker. And that story dramatically illustrates poetic realism because it describes how we come home to the natural world when we come home to ourselves. It describes how if we are in disharmony with ourselves, we are in disharmony with the natural world. So in short, that story, very quickly, a village is experiencing, we can put it anywhere today, but originally I think it's in southern China, the story. Village is experiencing years of drought, and the elders get together and they decide that they've heard, one of them, or several of them have heard of a rainmaker. So they gather whatever values they have and assign, I think sometimes it's one, sometimes it's two young men in the village to go in search of the rainmaker. And they go and they travel and they take long journeys, arduous, difficult journeys, and they finally find the rainmaker. And they tell him about the plight of their village and give him whatever treasures the village was able to amass, present to him, and he agrees to go with them. And so they start the arduous journey back. And as they approach the village, you could see it. It's just right there over the last hill. The rainmaker says, I will stop here and stay in this little hut. And the young man is perplexed. He says, the village is over there. He says, no, I will stay here. And so the young man goes to the village, and the villagers have seen him coming with the figure of the rainmaker, but he's now entered the village by himself. And they question him, he says, well, he wants to stay in the hut. And depending on the story and the details, it's a certain period of time, let's call it 3 days. And then it begins to rain. They're amazed. And so he goes to the villagers and they say, but what did you do? You didn't come into the village, you stayed in the hut. And he said, I could feel as I got close to the village, how out of harmony this village was with itself. And I would be contaminated by that, and I then would lose my harmony with nature. And so if I was to help you, I had to first be in harmony with myself, to bring that back to the village so that we could all be in harmony with nature. That's what I'm trying to suggest about the poetic realism of the world. That sense of being in balance with the rhythms, the soul, the seasons of nature. We don't do that so much anymore. And I've experienced it, though, in several places. I have to say here, living in this small village in France, in Bourgogne, France, living closer to nature with my wife than I have for a long time. We lived in Santa Barbara. It was beautiful, but this is close to nature. And I experienced it in the African bush several times. I've written about that in different places. And I think most deeply when I went to the Antarctic in 2009. Now, phenomenology and Jung's archetypal psychology are paths, I would say, of homecoming, in the sense of coming back to our relationship with nature. Each in its own way is an education in learning how to pause, to slow down, to notice the unexpected solace of silence, to wander in wonder, to attend with patience, P-A-T-I-E-N-C-E, to those occasions when, maybe for example, a shaft of light on a dew-dipped leaf in the early morning might reveal the extraordinary in the ordinary. Simple thing, nothing great, but it can make you pause and stop you in your tracks. Or maybe this sudden sense of being seen by an animal as it crosses your path on an early morning walk. That might uncover the splendor of the simple. Or the smile on the face of a child might open up or display the miracle in the mundane, as moments that might awaken a sense, paradoxically it seems, a sense of sorrow at what has been lost, and then might become a step toward engaging in a heartfelt way the ecological crises from the depth of soul. Somewhere I know, I don't remember where, but I think this is a profound insight of Freud's. The psyche's way of finding something is by losing it. Well, you know, maybe we've had to go so far away from nature with our technological advances that maybe now, even in the midst of crises, it's like in a Greek drama, the Anantiadromia can begin. And we might be able to see that from this long journey away from nature, what we have given up, and maybe that begins the journey of, or what we've lost, the journey of homecoming. That's why I ended my book on technology with a picture of the Earth as seen from space. And I interviewed one of the early astronauts, and he spoke of it in that way, Alan Bean, one of the early Gemini astronauts. Now, I need to make a brief detour by way of a confession. One other thing about, you know, Freud, the psyche's way of finding something is by losing it. You know, Freud also said that when he gets there, he finds the poets have already been there. He won the Goethe Prize for literature. Well, here's a poet who knows that it's by leaving things that we know them. It's D.S. Eliot. We shall not cease from exploration, he says. And the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So in 2014, I published a book of poems leading toward the poet eavesdropping on the poetry of everyday life. In the introduction to that collection, I described how the book began with a dream, with 3 scenes and multiple images, which ended with a figure of a poet guiding me to the threshold between out of the worlds of academic psychology and into the world of everyday life, the veil of soul making, although the dream didn't say it that way. That dream encoded, I had it maybe 15, 20 years ago, and those kind of dreams stay with you. It encoded a story of my life and work in psychology, having entered psychology in 1964 through the door of psychology as a natural science and through philosophy. I spent 50 years trying to find the exit door of poetry, because my hopes for psychology is helping me find my way home, even in that inchoate sense when I was 20, 21, feeling like an orphan in the world, that it was an utter disappointment, particularly about its language. So I've been looking for that exit door of poetry ever since, and I've never found it. Because as the final image in the dream indicates, it ends on a threshold, my search for that exit door. So in the introduction to the book of poems, I had to confess that I am not a poet, but have been and remain a psychologist leaning toward the poets for guidance in how to speak to those epiphanies of psychological life that are like fireflies in the night that light up the darkness for a moment before they disappear. It is the problem which the Irish poet Brendan Kennelly describes in his wonderful book, Man Made of Rain. How, he asks, is one to give words afterwards to a vision as it was experienced? And it was that same feeling that is in the introduction to my book on research, about seeing the vast greenness and trying to describe that wonderful, overflowing greenness where I was writing or trying to write this book. And every phrase I used alluded to it, but never could fully capture it. But poetry does suggest, it seems to me, that the language of psychological life, if it is to be faithful to those epiphanies, has to avoid the languages of science and philosophy as their go-to position. Because to do that would be like capturing those fireflies and sealing them in a jar where eventually the light dims and goes out. When I was writing this book of poems, I remembered I used to do that as a boy in summer, and I was really, I recovered that memory. I'd get maybe a half a dozen and they would light up the jar. But you kept them in the jar. You nailed them down, you contained them, you captured them, and the light died out. And I think sometimes the language, the barbarous language of psychology as a natural science or philosophical systems that we build kills the soul of psychology. Poetry suggests then that language, if it is to be responsive to psychological life on its terms, has to be a way of saying, and I'm very careful with the words I use here, a way of speaking that alludes to those moments, to those epiphanies of psychological life that remain elusive. Dreams, fantasies, images, feelings, sparks, intuitions. But please do not mistake my intention here. I am not saying that either scientific psychology with its explanations of psychological life, which are increasingly neurological ones, or philosophical theories of psychological life, including depth psychological theories, I am not saying they are useful, not useful, of course they are, and I'm not saying that they are false. They are perspectives. Rather, I am appealing for what is left out when the poets of psychological life that I've been trying to talk about here is forgotten, ignored, or dismissed. For 50 years now, psychology has been for me a bridge between those two doors, and along the way have been numerous occasions when I have been stopped in my tracks and drawn by dreams, symptoms, and the general mess of life into what feels like an abyss. In this descent, the poet is guided by the depth psychologist and learns, that is, the psychologist learns to see in the dark light of the underworld, and through the eyes of death. That's what I think is a very keen lesson about any descent into the unconscious. You see things from the side of death. Rilke's incredible poem, Orpheus, Hermes, Eurydice, is a prime example of this moment, which, like all poetry, has to be embodied by being read aloud and feeling the rhythm of the words in your legs. It is a sin, if I'm being overly dramatic, to read poetry in silence. Phenomenology as homecoming. For the sake of time, I will illustrate with an example how phenomenology opens psychology to a poetics of psychological life. It's an example I draw from the phenomenological psychology of G.H. Vandenberg, who has been the major inspiration for my work and life and was a good colleague and friend. For Vandenberg, phenomenology invites one to encounter the epiphanies of the world's poetic realism. He gives beautiful examples. You can find some of that on my website, some of the articles that are listed there as PDFs, like Psychology as Homecoming, or Conversations Vandenberg, some title like that. But phenomenology for him invites one with a recovered, to engage the world with a recovered sense of wonder. And is that not what phenomenology at its best does? Makes one naive enough to wander in wonder, to learn to look at the world again, or as Merleau-Ponty notes, to be a perpetual beginner. A good summary of Vandenberg's work can be found, as I said, in my website. Or here are the two articles: Phenomenology as Homecoming, and the necessity for the humanities in psychology. Now, the following example that I want to give for Phenomenology as Homecoming is from one of the participants in a webinar class I'm currently doing called Restoring Broken Bonds Between Nature and Soul, Inner Journeys in the Outer World, which is very much like what I'm doing here tonight. That class is part of a 6-part series on ecology and soul. In that webinar, I gave examples of those epiphanies of psychological life, and I asked the participants to share their own stories. And this is what one of them sent to me in an email. So I'm quoting. She writes, "My own silent moment in nature happened one cold January night in Boston, Massachusetts, when I was 24 years old. She's now a woman in her early 60s. Around 9 p.m., I took my rescue mother, she calls it, out for one last potty break walk. Snow blanketed the entire street and sidewalk. The only sound was the crunch of boots as I entered the vacant parking lot of our local church. Light from a faint street lamp fell on the black asphalt, causing the covering of ice to twinkle, even off in the distance. At one point, I gazed up. The black sky overhead exactly mimicked the floor of the parking lot, twinkling with 1,000 stars. I felt I was at one with the entire universe, being a part of a bigger round. I have never forgotten that cold January evening, which I call my own starry night." In reply to her, I said, "This is a wonderful experience that I was trying to suggest in our webinar that speaks to the sense of awe and wonder of being a part of something larger. Your description captures that so beautifully in the silence of the snow and the details, in the crunching sound of your footsteps, in the mirroring of above and below, and the extraordinary in the ordinary. That happened in an ordinary moment of taking one's dog for a walk at night. Something extraordinary. That's the poetic realism of such moments that make us human and enlarge the world. Such moments, I say, are apocalyptic. And here we have to, and here's an important point for me, we have to learn to really love words and not just hear their surface meaning, but to be curious about where they sink their roots and what soil. And the word apocalyptic is so apt for a poetics of psychological life. We have forgotten that the word apocalypse means in its origins an unveiling, an uncovering, a revealing of what has been concealed. And today we associate it only with catastrophe. But apocalypse is an apt word for these epiphanies of the world's poetic realism. And I would say, when you have a moment like that, when the veil parts, that can seem also like a catastrophe. So that maybe is part of it now. A catastrophe for the world that we have lost touch with in those moments that enlarge the world. The poet Wallace Stevens speaks to what I call apocalyptic moments. He says this, and I'm quoting, "Poetry is the enchantment of the world, the incantation of the world, the singing of the world into existence under the spell of imagination. One of the enlargements of life that offers a possible form of redemption which saves the sense of the world for us. And in a phrase that joins the poet with the depth psychologist, Wallace Stevens says that is the therapeutic task of poetry, to enlarge life and our sense of the world under the spell of imagination. To get a feel for these apocalyptic moments and their catastrophic challenges, I quote these few lines from his poem, The Man with the Blue Guitar. They said, you have a blue guitar. You do not play things as they are. The man replied, things as they are changed upon the blue guitar. And they said then, to play you must attune beyond us, yet ourselves, attune upon the blue guitar of things exactly as they are. That's beautiful. Because when you have that poetic moment, or when you have that moment of a poetic realism described by that participant, you do see the world in its poetic realism as it is truly enlivened by imagination. And that's a tough thing to do in the age of empirical realism. Even Stevens always struggled with that. The whole relationship between imagination and the simple bareness of things, back and forth. The apocalyptic moments that reveal the poetic realism of the world do display things as they fundamentally are. The world leavened by the imagination. Imagination, the gift given by the gods as we fell from paradise. I come to my end here with a few remarks. Jung's psychology, dreaming as homecoming. In a letter to Anayala Yaffe, in response to a book she had sent to him, The Death of Virgil by Hermann Broch, Jung, recalling the sacrifice he made to make his psychology respectable, added a P.S. In that afterthought, and a thought that came in from the margins, carrying the feeling tone of his words, he asked this question. Anyway, why did it have to be the death of the poet? It's a strange question. And in my response to it, in an essay printed in spring, maybe 10 years ago. Anyway, why did it have to be the death of the poet, the Orphic roots of Jung's psychology, Orpheus? I described how Orpheus, the eponymous poet, whose very name is the name of poetry itself, has informed Jung's work. Even though in that PS he says he sacrificed his work. Why did it have to be the death of the poet? And he writes someplace that he does that because otherwise he would have produced only shards. I respect that. I think the psychologist is not a poet. If he's a poet, then all the better. But then I think he's a poet. But I think that there is the task that psychologists are called to learn to speak a psychological language through the poets that really is faithful to the poetics of psychological life. So let's begin with this possibility. If a poem is a waking dream woven in the veil of soul-making in response to the seductive appeals of the world, its charms, and the dream is a poem crafted in the night school of soul, then with poems and dreams, we are in the domain of image. And again, given the limits of time, I will use only one example to discuss the necessity for the image in the poetics of psychological life, which is just the deepening and how I've been inspired by Jung's notion of psyche as image. But it's the relation of image to metaphor and how that changes how we understand and work with the dream. For more detailed discussion, it's in my on my homepage website under articles, Conversations in the Gap Between Mind and Soul, Grammatical Reflections in the Places of Thinking. It's a letter to James Hillman. So my example now, to give an example of dreaming as homecoming, the importance of the image, the relation to metaphor, and how we work with dreams. I take the example from the poet and literary critic Howard Nemeroff. He writes, while I am thinking about metaphor, a flock of purple finches arrives on the lawn. Since I haven't seen these birds for some years, I'm only fairly sure of their being, in fact, purple finches. So I get down Peterson's field guide and I read his description, quote, male about the size of a house sparrow, rosy red, brightest on head and rump, end of quote. That checks quite well, but his next remark in Peterson's field guide, quote, a sparrow dipped in raspberry juice is decisive. It fits. I look out the window again and now I know that I am seeing purple finches. That is very simple, so simple in fact that I hesitate to look any further into the matter, for as soon as I do, I shall see that the simplicity is not altogether canny. Why should I be made certain of what a purple finch is by being led to contemplate a sparrow dipped in raspberry juice? Have I ever dipped, he asks, a sparrow in raspberry juice? Has anyone? And yet there it is, quite certain and quite right. Peterson and I and the finches are in agreement. The uncanny aspect of this moment is that Nemiroff sees the purple finch through the image of a sparrow dipped in raspberry juice. That image is not a fact, in the same way that the stones in his garden are. For should he, in some obsession with empirical realism, rush into his garden, take hold of the bird in his hand, it would not drip with juice. But the image is not an idea in his mind either, for his gaze is already drawn first into the garden by the birds. Nemiroff is seeing not with, but through the eye, recalling the words of the visionary poet William Blake, who said, "We believe a lie if we see with and not through the eye." This neither nor quality of the image poses an ontological challenge about what is reality. Because a purple finch is and is not a sparrow dipped in raspberry juice. How can something be what it is and not be what it is at the same time? David Miller, a Jungian, a good Jungian friend of mine, and James Hillman, many years ago wrote a brilliant article about alchemy, called it The Stone That Is Not a Stone. Stan Marlin's work, another Jungian analyst, has been very, very helpful in that regard in his work on alchemy. But it raises then the question, an ontological question, how can something be and not be at the same time? And then how do we speak about such things that are and are not what they are? That poses an epistemological challenge about the nature of knowledge and knowing. The image requires a way of saying and speaking that unsays what it says, that alludes to what remains elusive, the phrase I used above in relation to those epiphanies of psychological life. Now I turn near the end to Jung, who regarding dreams said that every interpretation is a provisional one. And so we're asking, how do you talk about things that are and are not what they are? And he would qualify his interpretations, he says, by words such as maybe, perhaps, it might be so. What we say regarding the images in dreams is a perspective which aptly expresses the metaphorical character of psychological life that I described many years ago in my first book, Psychological Life, Science to Metaphor. And now that applies to how Jung qualifies the meaning of dream images. They're provisional. Dream images are and are not what we say of them. They are as such possibilities of what might or could be. And that has changed how I work with dreams, particularly because of what I learned working with actors and how they get into character. Indeed, the dream itself, we might call, I do, the possibility of possibility, the display of what one's life or world might be, or how the world might be otherwise, and we be otherwise than as it is. Here are a few lines of a poem of William Blake, which could easily be imagined as a dream. To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wild flower, and hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. I remember once my grandson came to me, and he was holding a flower. This was still when the wonder of the world was there. And he went like this, and things scattered. And he said, "You see that, Grandpa?" And I said, "Yes. What do you see?" And he said, I see fairies leading the flower. That's incredible. Blake's vision is a vision of what is and is not so, like Nemirov's purple finches. Images whose grammar is the subjunctive mood, which expresses conditions contrary to fact or a wish or a regret. Indeed, this mood is at the foundation of depth psychology and Freud's definition of the dream as the fulfillment of a wish. But his theory, I think, was betrayed in his work of interpretation. Where the id was, there shall the ego be. How do we stay in the subjunctive mood of the dream? Jung's psychology, I think, remains closer to the dream's mood, which allows us to work with dreams as a kind of, if you want, dress rehearsal for waking life, as a way of embodying and enacting the images in the dream as possibilities to imagine, including the world as a poetic realism. All the world is a stage upon which we tell our stories. Dreams that rise up from the psychoid level might then be a way to recover the poetic realism of the world, to unforget Plato's anamnesis, our broken bonds with the natural world, and imagine our place within the order of its rhythms, harmonizing the seasons of nature with the seasons of soul. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed presenting this. I hope it has meant something to you. And now I am prepared for conversation and comments and criticisms. Thank you. I hope I did not go on too long.
Robert.
Did I go on too long?
Não, tá ótimo, tá ótimo. Podia falar umas 3 horas, estava ótimo. Robert, isso nos pareceu mais um concerto poético do que efetivo. Isso nos pareceu mais um concerto poético do que efetivamente uma palestra. E acho que a ideia é exatamente essa. Queria fazer 2 perguntas para você, Robert. Quando eu comecei a ler teus livros, eu sempre tentava e me frustrava numa tentativa de descobrir aonde estava o fenomenólogo, aonde estava o homem que estudava Jung e aonde estava o poeta. Eu nunca conseguia descobrir as fronteiras desses 3 personagens. Eu desisti de tentar encontrar esses 3 personagens. Queria te perguntar se é isso mesmo. Não tem mais fronteiras? Esses lugares todos se misturaram em você? Essa é uma primeira pergunta. Uma segunda questão, pode ser? Quando você fala de uma carta do Jung...
Yes, but I can't tell who is speaking. Who is speaking right now? Oh, is this... Oh, it's Marcos and you're translating. Okay, right.
Segunda,
okay.
Yeah. Segunda questão. Você cita uma carta do Jung, onde o Jung fala sobre a morte do poeta, certo? E há uma carta também dele, no final da vida, onde ele diz que ninguém entendeu a obra dele, ninguém foi capaz de compreender a obra dele, e somente um poeta poderia entender. Queria que você comentasse um pouco essas 2 possibilidades. Parabéns pela palestra, pelo concerto poético.
You're very welcome and very kind. Thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I won't be able to sleep tonight. It's after 10 o'clock here, so I'm enthusiastic. Your first question, I think if I remember your first question correctly, are there any boundaries among phenomenologist, depth psychologist, and the poet in me? That's a good question. I don't think I've ever really kind of thought about it in that way. But now that I think about it, I'll trust what I'm feeling. And I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling sad because I could very easily lose touch with the poetics. I realized that as I was preparing for the class the other day, which was like this one tonight, and I got out the book that I wrote, is leaning toward the poet, eavesdropping on the poetry of everyday life. And that was a part of my life that I lost touch with. And why? And suddenly I got a lot of recognition for the work that I did. And I think I got too seduced by ambition. Not a bad thing, but you know, I had a lot of responses to the work I was doing, and it has increased as I got older. But I lost that sense of silence and solitude that I felt when I was in the Antarctic or when I was writing the book of poems. And now that I'm back in France, I'm getting back in touch with it. So are there boundaries? No, I think they're integrated in my life when all of the things are working well. But I think the predominant at basis, the rock upon which my life as a psychologist and a phenomenologist trained in both traditions, they sink their roots in the poetics. And I'm most happy when I'm thinking about examples of the poetic realism of the world and trying to give language to it. That's the best way I could answer that first question. Your second question, could you repeat your second question for me, please?
Você lembra, Isa? Tá, então vamos lá. Você cita na sua fala uma carta do Jung, onde Jung coloca a questão da morte do poeta. E tem uma outra carta dele no final da vida, uma carta queixosa, onde ele se lamenta não terem compreendido a obra dele. E ele diz, talvez somente um poeta pudesse compreender. Queria ouvir a tua opinião sobre esses dois lugares.
I know that letter, and I wish I had remembered it. You are so right, but isn't it interesting that it comes near the end of his life? Because if you go back to the first quote, to Ani Yafi, he's still in the midst of his life, and he says, I would have produced only a heap of shards. But the tone of the PS in the question, why did it have to be the death of the poet? I think he realizes it was a sacrifice. At the end of his life, I think it's right that he says, he doesn't say the sacrifice was not worth it, but he knows that only the poet can understand him. And I think that's absolutely right. So what that says to me, Marcus, is, you know, we can't, and I wanted to say that psychology as a natural science is legitimate. It's a perspective. And psychology as a human science is a perspective, and depth psychology. But wouldn't it be wonderful if we could keep whatever perspective we're in, if we could keep alive that the very foundation of psyche is the veil of soul making and those epiphanies that I tried to describe, the aesthetic life of soul, the feeling function. And if we could keep that as our root. And to me, that's important now. That's why I started. We're living in a time of real crisis, 100 seconds to midnight. Because unless collectively, and we have to start individually, unless we can really recover the sense of being a part of nature, not apart from it, I think we're doomed. So that's the work. That's why I do this, and that's why I was so happy when I got your thing. I mean, you know, and I really think that your group is doing something that is incredible, and so it gives me hope. So thank you. Thanks for that quote, that other one.
Eu que te agradeço, Robert. Pessoal, aberto para perguntas. Coloquem os nomes e a gente faz as perguntas, tá bom? Vamos lá? Dani Lascani, querida.
Olá. Oi, Robert. Robert, é um prazer estar aqui com você e queria te dizer que você tem sido uma grande revelação para mim. Eu tenho te acompanhado no curso do Ecology and Soul e estou gostando muito. E, na verdade, eu pensei em duas perguntas. A primeira, eu não sei exatamente o que perguntar, mas assim, você traz muito no seu curso uma experiência que você teve na Antártida, né, de homecoming, né, essa sensação de lar. E você trouxe uma relação da nossa psique com os espectros de cores e traz um pouco dessa... Talvez o verde seja, né, a primeira cor aí que a gente tenha se relacionado com, né, na consciência ou na... E eu fiquei pensando um pouco, né, assim, na relação com a neve, do branco. Eu já ouvi dizer também que nós temos uma sensação, né, ao viver algumas experiências que nos lembram as primeiras sensações de quando o ser humano se deslumbrou com essas paisagens, né? Então, eu queria que você falasse um pouquinho sobre isso. E a segunda pergunta que eu tenho é essa sensação de homecoming que você se refere, né? E que é muito bonito ver você falando dessa sensação, porque é muito difícil dizer em palavras, só um poeta mesmo para poder dizer. Você fala que é um paradoxo porque existe um encontro ao perder. E eu fico imaginando que para a gente poder encontrar caminhos possíveis para o nosso mundo, né, para o futuro do nosso mundo, nós temos que estar dispostos a perder. E eu fico um pouco com a sensação assim de, será que na nossa cultura estamos dispostos a perder para poder encontrar?
Daniela, is that your first name?
Yes.
That's beautifully expressed, particularly the last part. I'll get to what you asked about the whiteness. I'll make some remarks about the Antarctic. But I think the question that you pose, are we willing to lose something? No. I think it is the extraordinary individual who, looking around and seeing that the way he or she is living his or her life is causing destruction in the relationship with the children, with colleagues. And that the only thing that is really going to make a difference is if he changes or she changes. Most of the time that means a willingness to go into death psychotherapy. I don't think many people make that choice willingly. It's hard. It's difficult. I'm not criticizing anybody for not wanting to do that. All the times that I've gone into analysis, it has been a very, very difficult move to go through and take a look at oneself again and to see the shadows that you cast, to see the monsters that still lurk within you. That's why I wrote the book about Frankenstein, cultural level. So if it's difficult for individual, Mary Shelley's story, that's why I wrote my book, retelling a story from the monster's point of view. If it's hard for individuals to give up, to lose something, it seems almost impossible to see that happen on a grand scale. So what might make it happen? Breakdowns, individual breakdowns. And I think one particular, at least in my own life, and the way I've worked with patients over the years, it is only when a patient really is at the edge of an abyss and things are breaking down that the possibility for a breakthrough comes. We are at a moment in culture now where everything is breaking down. So that in itself is hopeful. But where the breakthrough is coming from, you don't know. So what can you do? Can we be in service to the psyche of the world? That's how I think that's how I can do it. In the 60s and 70s, I went out and I protested the war in Vietnam. I was appropriate at my age. But now, writing, thinking, being with people like tonight, every encounter that I have, trying to bring that sensibility to it, that's the hope I have. But I don't think it's anything that we willingly do. I think it comes on us. Breakdown happens and breakthrough is possible. So. And then you had a second question, or a first question, whichever way it came, about the Antarctic. If I don't do justice to what you were asking, please let me know. My journey to the Antarctic in 2009 began with a dream that I had had 30 years earlier. And that in and of itself is important because I had forgotten that dream, but Psyche, the dream of 30 years earlier, didn't forget me. This was part of my fate to go there. And that's an important thing because if I didn't take up that challenge, then my fate would have hounded me. And our task is to change our fate into a destiny that we take up. So through an odd email that I got from a friend who told me about his trip to the Antarctic, I remembered that dream. And I said to my wife, Veronica, who I mentioned earlier, I said, I have to go to the Antarctic. She said, okay, you go. And I said, I looked at the journey and the trip and what I want. It's going to cost about $25,000. She said, it's only money. Isn't it wonderful to be married to somebody like that, you know? So I was eligible for Social Security in the United States. So it starts with a dream. I go, I make an appointment. I think I'm going to run into Kafka's bureaucratic nightmare. I'm ushered into this room with this very charming middle-aged lady. She says, I've been looking at your record. And she said, we owe you, the government owes you some back money because you haven't collected your Social Security whenever you could. I think I was 60 something, then 67. So I thought, okay, maybe $1,000. I said, well, how much do you owe me? She said, $24,500. And I said, could you give me $500 more? The trip was paid for by that synchronicity. And I mentioned that to my friends. They never heard of that before. So what started with a dream and the intention goes out into the world. When you open your heart for something that is really calling you, we think we're the masters of our fate. We're agents in service to something larger than ourselves. The intention is out there. It is supported by my wife. I have to go. And a synchronicity happens. The money is there. And I get there. And the whiteness itself was hypnotizing. But when you're there is no whiteness. There are shades of white, shades of ice, different colors. It's a land of crystal cathedrals. And I felt in that place, as far away from home as I could get, I was starting my journey home. And so when I came back, I said to my wife, I've got to make a film about this. I said, I know I could write about it. That's my strong point. I can do that. But I said, this wants something else for me. So I had a friend, former student who wrote film for Hollywood movies. He put me in touch with a sound engineer, and I made a small little film, DVD. I took 500 of the images that I took there. I chose 36 of them. He set it to music. We did a voiceover, and it exists now on a disc. It's called Antarctica and the Journeys in the Outer World. And it's a poem in a way, to being there. I mean, the beauty, it reminded me of what Rilke says of the angel. Every angel is terrible because it takes up into itself its own streaming beauty. I was in a place where I know the gods lived there. It was a holy landscape. I was impressed by the solitude and the silence, the serenity. And yeah, so as I get on in age, I'll be 78 in 2 months. I said to my wife, look, as I get older, I know where I want to be buried. And she said, oh, I know what you're going to say. Take my ashes to the Antarctic. God, it's impossible. You're not allowed to do that. But that's what it means to me. I felt so at peace there. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question. I sort of got carried away with the memories.
Eu não sei se essa pergunta tem resposta, né? Mas respondeu, sim.
Vamos lá. Obrigado, Dani.
It's just conversation.
Ieda.
Oi, Robert. Imenso prazer te conhecer. Obrigada, Marcos, também, porque eu comecei a estudar psicologia arquetípica, na verdade, por causa de literatura e poesia, que é uma coisa que me interessa e que eu gosto. Eu gosto muito de escrever, depois veio a psicologia, né, junto. Então, muito emocionante te ouvir hoje, fazendo esse link. E a minha pergunta para você é o seguinte, eu até escrevi, que é tão complicado para a gente até juntar essas coisas. Será que você poderia falar um pouco mais sobre a questão do apocalipse, no sentido das epifanias, das revelações, né? E desse momento atual que nós estamos vivendo no mundo, né? Ou seja, o que será que está sendo revelado poeticamente nesse momento do mundo que estamos passando? Obrigada.
Thank you for your question. That's the key question, isn't it? That's what I mean about looking at things from the point of view of symptoms. So the apocalypse, what is being unveiled? And if I just take COVID-19, I started working on a series of attempts to look at COVID-19 from its point of view and asking it, what is it trying to say to us in this moment when things seem to be on the verge of collapse? I mean, we're experiencing a tremendous pandemic. And there's 16 of these blogs. I've finished about 10 of them. I'm not done with them yet. But the continuous thinking about it is motivated by this one point. If we ask, what does the virus want from us? Then what we are faced with is perhaps the possibility that instead of trying to just rush for a vaccine, which I'm not opposed to, instead of trying to do all of the containment measures, which I am not opposed to, they are necessary, absolutely. Nothing is going to change, I think it is saying to us in this symptomatic way, this catastrophe, this apocalyptic moment, unless we look at those conditions that have made the virus possible and necessary. What is it in the human psyche that has allowed and made necessary the calling forth of this symptom? What are we being asked to look at? And that's why the Frankenstein book is connected to what I'm trying to do, because it's a series of 8 questions, and Victor Frankenstein is an icon for acting as if he is a god. He'll be a new god of creation. And the creature he makes, he abandons, refuses to name, calls him devil, demon, monster, and exiles him. And the creature appeals to him over and over again. He calls him monster, so I stay with that. And the book, my book on Mary Shelley's book, the Frankenstein book, goes to the side of the monster in 8 questions. And he asks us things like, I phrase it this way, is Mary Shelley's story, for example, a prophecy of the dying of nature? That's what the monster is really saying, not Victor Frankenstein's side of the story. You know, her book was subtitled Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. So Mary Shelley is retelling the mythic tale of Prometheus. But Prometheus in the myth is a demigod. And when he sees how humankind is suffering, he steals fire from the gods. So he crosses the boundaries between humans and the gods to bring a gift to mankind. And sometimes Prometheus is called the creator of humankind. He brings the gift of fire. Well, Victor Frankenstein, thinking of himself as a new god, using the forces of lightning that he tames as electricity, he erases that boundary between humans and the gods, because he says he will be the new God who will erase the stain of death from life. And what else does he do? He refuses any part of the feminine in his work of creation. His beloved Elizabeth Lavenza dutifully waits for him to finish his work. She eventually dies. So there are 8 ways in which Mary Shelley's story is a cautionary tale, telling us to look at what we have done to make the crisis that we are facing now. So my book, in those 8 questions, talks about 8 specific ways in which we are dealing with catastrophes now. The dying of nature, the eclipse of the feminine, what's happening. Look at what we're doing now. I mean, this is great that we could be together across time zones, etc. But we see each other, we can hear each other, but I can smell none of you, and you can't smell me. And we can't really touch each other or be touched by each other. And so there is something else in one of the not the webinars, but the things I'm trying to write about COVID. Is it possible that, because one of the things that happens is that we've created these conditions because we've erased boundaries between us and other species, between species themselves. All of our technology takes us to different parts of the world. So we've lost the sense of boundaries. And I raise the question, can we really live without boundaries? Can we really live as if we are gods with no sense of something higher than us that gives us our measure and gives us our place? I don't think we can. And what do we have now? We have a response that says we can be everywhere and anywhere, but as basically disembodied. And so while this digital technology, like all technologies, is a tool that has advantages, if we don't think carefully about what we lose in this, in what we're doing right now. You know, the poet E. Cummings says, since you and I have lips to sing and to speak with, who cares if some one dumb-eyed son of a bitch invents a thermometer to measure spring with? The thing is to eat flowers and not be afraid. You know, how we can't kiss each other here. He says, he who knows only the syntax of things, the meaning, will never wholly kiss you. We can't embrace each other. So it's a tool that has advantages, but we're losing something. And I'll end with this. Doing the Frankenstein book, I had to come to terms. I don't know if anybody in your audience has read the work of Ray Kurzweil. He's a futurist. He works for Amazon. He's a guy that has to be taken seriously. And his book, The Singularity is Near, predicts, for example, that within the next century, we will no longer need our bodies. We will download everything that has ever been amassed by human consciousness and we'll load it into the cloud. The cloud. I mean, we're taking one step towards that, and I tried to say that. So while I'm not saying we shouldn't have this, we have to use our technology knowing what we're leaving behind. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Robert.
Robert, queria te fazer uma outra questão. James Hillman, tem uma frase que me parece que modifica completamente os caminhos da psicologia, onde ele fala da base poética da mente. Como é que é o teu encontro? Como foi o teu encontro com Hillman? Aonde a psicologia arquetípica se tornou talvez um lugar onde a poesia da vida ou da psique tenha encontrado um terreno fértil para poder acontecer. Eu queria também que, se você pudesse, que você falasse um pouco o que foram os anos 70 na Universidade de Dallas, tua experiência como professor, a ida para o Hillman lá.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, it's true. Hillman speaks about the poetic basis of mind. I certainly was thinking about that before I met James, and that's why I wrote the book on metaphor, which is connected with image. And so there was a natural convergence. But when I first met James Hillman, we clashed heads. I respected James and he respected me. If one thing is true about James, as I knew him, he hated what I came to call Hillmaniacs, people who adored him. He liked a good fight, so we fought. And I was always saying, you know, Jim, in meetings and in early kinds of conferences, your Jungian psychology is still too interior. You're not enough in the world. And then suddenly he would say, well, you know, I remember one argument he said, but, you know, for a phenomenologist, a door is a door. I said, well, it's a little bit more than that. So we fought back and forth. And that was a creative tension, creative conflict, I would say. James was definitely influenced by his time at Dallas. He had earlier met Ed Casey, wonderful phenomenological philosopher. So he was already tempted by phenomenology. But I think he really yet didn't get it in those years at Dallas with myself and Robert Sardello, in these conversations, deepened his phenomenology as it deepened my appreciation for archetypal psychology. So it was a very fruitful meeting. for the two of us. That was, I started at Dallas in 72. He came in 79. And I think it was through probably the mid-80s before the whole thing fell apart. And he and Sardella went to the Dallas Institute. I was made a fellow there, but I stayed on at the University of Dallas for several reasons. One, to finish up some graduate students. And then James went his way, and I got this invitation to go to Pacifica Graduate Institute. And that's why I think my relationship with James really matured and deepened. Because he would come out and visit, and I got to know him not just as a scholar and a colleague, but I would say as a friend and a real gentleman. And I remember one day, and so I'll tell maybe one or two memories. So this is now in the early 90s, when I was at Pacifica and he would come out. And one day we were sitting outside. And I said, you know, Jim, he always wanted to be called James, that was fine. I said, you strike me as the last person in our digital age with the glut of information, and to be the last one to really kind of master a whole discipline. You know, you're with those giants like Freud and Adler and Jung and all of the early post-Freudians and post-Jungians. I said, you're part of that, but it seems to me you're the last one because nobody can do that now. And he turned to me and he said, I had three things in my life. He said, I had luck, I had money, and I had talent. And he turned to me and he said, and Jim wasn't one to pander to people, give false compliments. He said, I don't know if you have luck, I don't know if you have money, but you have talent. And he said, you have to do your work. And that's the only thing that matters. And that's what I think he did. Now, the other thing was, James was a son of a bitch. He could be narcissistic, arrogant, dismissive. And if he disagreed with you in public, you better be prepared for a good fight. But his devilish qualities he owned up to. You know, I think he really tried to live out his psychology, but he wasn't a saint. And that's why I think he didn't like anybody to really see him as St. James. I would say that next to my mentor in phenomenology, Vandenberg, and the English poet Kathleen Rain, who's a good friend of mine, Blake scholar, fine lady whom I loved, and James Hillman, and Ivan Illich, the cultural critic. They were four very important people in my life. And I'll end with this good example. Back to the days in Dallas. Vandenberg, I invited him to the university. And James was then on the staff. And I figured, okay, I arranged for an evening, invited the whole university to this huge auditorium. And I arranged it for each of them to be on stage and to really talk out their differences. And I figured, this is it. I will see it displayed, so I'll know that the war goes on in my head. Am I an archetypal Jungian? Am I a phenomenologist, etc.? How do I balance those two? I said, now I will see it displayed. And who's ever the last one standing, I guess that decides it for me. Was I disappointed? They could not have been anything but the epitome of European scholars and gentlemen who appreciated each other's differences. And that taught me something. That the real genuine psychological person is the one who can listen with his ear. Doesn't have to agree. And that made a big difference internally to me, psychologically. So, yeah. I could go on all night about stories with James, but that will suffice. On my website, there are 2 letters I wrote to James for a book that was published by the Dallas Institute that really deal with poetics, one, and the other one was with conversations with the dead. So that gives some more information.
Obrigado, Robert. Robert, só para você saber, Ed Casey vai estar conosco em dezembro, aqui também falando para a gente. Então, acho que eu queria te anunciar isso.
Say hello for me to him. I lost touch with him.
Luciana Ximenes, tá bom. Luciana.
Robert, primeiro eu queria te dizer como eu estou tocada e sensibilizada com a tua palestra, e não só com o conteúdo, com a forma como você traz as coisas que você fala. É realmente contagiante a sua emoção e o seu envolvimento com tudo isso que você está falando. Eu tenho estudado recentemente bastante coisa, tenho lido bastante coisa sobre a Anima Mundi, e dentre eles eu li um texto do David Pace, eu não sei se você conhece esse texto, onde ele faz uma crítica de como Jung se relaciona com esse conceito, né? Ele fala que o Jung só chegou nessa história da alma, do mundo mesmo, perto lá de quando ele falou da sincronicidade. Que primeiro ele fala que a gente só consegue ver o mundo projetado da nossa alma, né, como projeção nossa, ou um mundo como mágico, né? Essa é a visão que o Pace tem nesse texto, isso, em poucas palavras, bem grotescamente. E eu fiquei pensando assim que faz muito sentido que a gente não consiga se relacionar com o mundo e a alma dele, justamente pelo nosso antropocentrismo, pelo jeito como a gente foi desenvolvendo as nossas relações com as outras espécies, com os outros seres. Acho muito difícil a gente se relacionar com o mundo sem ser como projeção nossa. E aí eu fiquei me perguntando como é que o que será que sobraria se a gente conseguisse retirar a nossa projeção, a projeção da nossa alma na alma do mundo.
Well, I know now that being here today is like being with a group of really good, excellent colleagues, because that's a fundamental question. I mean, I assume you know Louise von Franz's book, Projection and the Recollection of Being. It is true that projection is a psychological reality. But then you ask, what is left if we withdraw our projections? Well, let me scale down the example. I used to use this with my clinical students. I would try and talk about this whole problem, projection, and what happens when you begin. I don't like the language withdraw projections, but I'll go with that. I've had a different way of thinking about that because of the way I work with the transference in therapy. But that's not the point here. So I would use this example. I would say to my students, is there anybody in the class who has ever fallen in love? And of course, you know, it's already, you've got their attention. Because who's going to admit, what person's going to say, no, I've never fallen in love. So everybody, yeah, you know, we've all fallen in love. I said, well, in English, think about that phrase. We say, fall in love. And because I'm a phenomenologist, I like to speak through stories and get a little dramatic action. So I said, nobody ever, as far as I know, wakes up on a Monday morning, scratches his head. I'll use the male perspective here. Said, today I think I'll fall in love. It's not a decision of the will. I said, you get ready for the day, you go to your usual coffee stop on the way to work, and you walk in. So I'm using the male perspective, but you be anyway. And there she is. Turn it around, woman, there he is. Turn it around, he, she, it doesn't matter. There she is. And you fall in love. You don't know why, but something grabs you. That's a projection. You fall in love with the other through a projection. And so the story goes on. So I said, well, imagine it's two Pacifica students. And then I would set up the stage for this. And they come to Pacifica and they fall in love in the same way. And through the projection, the man has fallen in love without knowing with it, the epitome of whom he regards as the perfect woman, and vice versa. And they're living through that projection. But you know, I meant all the students and all of us know, that after a while, it's like the sand in an oyster, it begins to irritate. The projection begins to sort of get stale and tiring. And you find out that, oh, the one who I thought was the most perfect man or something, very irritated. And so a beginning conflict arises. And then eventually it gets so bad that one day one of them wakes up and says to the other, you're not the person I thought you were, and blah, blah, blah. And what happens? They split until they meet the next one that they fall in love with. And that's the reality. We go through life repeating the projections over and over. And the only thing that changes that is the willingness then to be with the other in the mystery and the magic and the wonder of who they are in their own light. And that means then you have to take a look at yourself and reclaim and say, for example, say, I wanted you to be, name it, X, Y, Z, whatever it is, that projection. And you're not that. And I can't blame you for that. So then I begin to ask, who are you? And then we have to discover each other beyond the projection. Does the projection ever totally go away? No. But what happens is that whatever projections I put on you or you put on me now is in company of the mystery and the magic of who that other is in their own right. And maybe some more projections go there too as well, but it's always that process of trying to see the other for who he or she is and not who he or she has to be for me. That's hard work. Poet Rilke said, love is the most difficult work of all, apart from which everything else you do in life is only a preparation. So learning how to love is why we're here. Learning how to love is why we're here. I can't think of any higher calling. And what is psychotherapy? In any case, the patient comes in, they project onto you all kinds of fantasies. I always tell my students, if you are really working in the depths, you have to learn to keep an appointment with the figures and not with the person who's projecting. You have to disappoint the person to keep the appointment with the figures who want to tell their story. And that means that you can't always be the daddy they never had. Sometimes it hurts, lots of times it does. But it's the timing that you as a therapist have to engage in order to let that happen. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I admit the reality of projection, but I see it differently as moving from inside to outside, but that's a whole other thing. In fact, I was going to say that one of the things was, for me, the question would have been, if this was like ongoing, etc. How do we take what I've been talking about, the poetic realism of the world, and work that in psychotherapy? How do you work with the dream and the subjunctive mood? Yeah, all of that has to be brought down into the reading of life. And I've always intended to write a book on how that changes therapy, the notion of the transference, the notion of projection, the notion of the symptom, but I never got around to it. So I'm writing a book that's called the book that I always wanted, the books I wanted to write, but I've never got around to it. So it's going to be a book with titles and empty pages, and leave it to other people if they want to do that. But I think the question of therapy lurks in the background of everything we're saying here. So thank you for that question. Projection. Yeah, that's true.
Obrigada, você.
Robert, você recentemente, você e Wolfgang Gigris protagonizaram talvez um dos mais interessantes, inteligentes e intensos debates dentro do campo junguiano na revista Spring. São duas visões de mundo completamente distintas e diferentes. Queria que você falasse um pouco de como é que foi a tua experiência de debater com Gigris.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good question. You know, I had published that article that he really then critiqued. And when I first read the critique, I was stunned and paralyzed because Gigris is a real scholar. I do not consider myself a scholar, not in his class at all. I'm not putting myself down. I know a lot of stuff, but I have a different temperament than he does. And I could not match him. So for 6 months, I couldn't do anything. And I read it, and I had 2 or 3 colleagues reading it, and they were supportive. Some supportive and saying, you know, you really have to deal with this. You can't just let this stand. So what I finally was able to latch onto was a key difference, I think, at least for me, was this, and I don't remember exactly what the words were. He didn't like my thing about linear perspective. So that was easier to handle. I could bring the resources that I used, and that could be a debate that just goes back and forth. But there was one point in his essay that I really felt needed to be addressed. And I don't know if I can use the exact words, but he felt that the task of the depth psychology was to stay in his or her corner and not be involved in changing the world. You know, that's a kind of activism. And maybe I'm oversimplifying, but he saw the psychological soul as having to do with, in his own Hegelian way, working its own mysteries apart from active engagement in the world. That went against my own temperament. So I thought on that ground, I could say my difference, because for me, the poet, again, Keats, call the world, if you please, the world of soul making. So in that respect, I was closer to Hillman, who had his differences with Gigris. And I remember once when I was in the midst of trying to deal with this, Hillman came over to my house for lunch and we were talking. And I asked him about that. And he said, you know, Gigris is a worthy opponent and a tough component. This is what he said to me. He said, but I cannot use my energy on fighting with him because then I won't do my own work. So I did the best I could and I let it stand at that. And I think the other person who took up, I think in a much better way, the debate with Gingrich than I was able to with Stan Marlin. So bottom line, I think there are differences. It's a difference in temperament and how we see the work of soul and psyche, or soul in the world. And it's where do we meet? You know, if he's one who walks on the beach and I'm a fish who swims in the sea, maybe those little moments when the tide comes in, there's that little piece of land where we can meet, but we're never going to be in the same world again. So, yeah. He argues philosophically, and while I was trained philosophically and I can think philosophically, that's not my strong point. So I think in the end, I would not have done the work that I've been doing since then if I just tried to stay on that philosophical track with him. And in the end, I didn't think it was worth it, you know. I mean, I respect him, but I don't agree with him.
Obrigado, tá ótimo. Pessoal, temos uma última pergunta. Quem se habilita? Andréa Cunha? Vamos, Andréa.
Eu pensei.
Então, eu senti aqui, eu intuí.
Tem um conceito de um indígena brasileiro chamado Ailton Krenak, que ele fala sobre fronteiras fluidas. É um tema que eu venho estudando, que são o tema dos povos indígenas no Brasil. E a maneira deles se relacionarem com a natureza, é óbvia, é muito diferente da nossa. E esse conceito de fronteiras fluidas, ele traz muito essa perspectiva da gente não ter contornos e a gente poder transitar entre vários mundos, no diálogo com a natureza, no diálogo nos territórios. Então, é um conceito que mexe comigo. Eu queria saber, como você disse que talvez não desse para viver sem fronteiras, ficou isso na minha cabeça.
Yeah. Thank you again for that question. I mean, a lot of these questions really challenge me very deeply and things I'm thinking about and I've been struggling with. I would say until quite recently, because of some of the work I'm doing, I would not have spoken about the necessity for borders. I prefer the word boundaries in a way to borders, and I don't mean by that walls. I'm not talking about Trump's walls, but I'm talking about borders that demarcate differences. And I do believe that it is essential to have that sense, because even from an ecological and environmental and evolutionary point of view, we are tribal people. We have our worldviews. Those are borders as well. But I do believe that given that, it gives you a place to stand. But at the same time, you have to be open to dialogue. So I know there's a quote from Jung that he, interestingly enough, wrote in the 30s at the rise of Nazism was beginning in Europe. He said, to the degree that one does not pay attention to the other within himself, he cannot recognize the other out there, and vice versa. Dialogue is the foundation for any human community. And I thoroughly believe that. But to have an honest dialogue, you have to know you take a stand here. So I don't believe in fluidity as anything goes or washes. You take a stand. And so for me, that means that you have to develop what I call a metaphoric sensibility. And a metaphoric sensibility is that you always you know that you are always in some perspective, worldview, myth, dream, complex, whatever it is. You have to know that even if you don't know what it is. And that allows you to be open to the other, to speak to you and with you, about you and about them. So you see what I'm saying? So once I'm giving that lecture and hitting that point about metaphor, somebody says, well, then what do you believe in? You know? That's a tough question, because if you always see your point of view, you still have to take a stand. So I like paradox. So my best answer, and this is addressing the thing about fluidity, I believe in making believe, I believe. Think about that. Because what I'm saying is being unsaid and being resaid. I believe in making believe, I believe. And if you can do that, and you can courage the willing suspension of disbelief, if you can really not just pretend to believe in the other person, but suspend your prejudices, then the possibility for compromise, respect, and coming to know your projections, going back to Luciana's question. So I don't disagree with what you say, but I would frame it a little bit differently. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you. Thank you.
Robert, queria muito te agradecer pela tua presença. Você talvez não tenha ideia do quão importante para nós, brasileiros, que estamos atravessando um momento tão difícil, Covid, política, queimadas, ouvir você e recuperar uma ideia de uma sensibilidade poética, de um realismo poético, como a importância da poesia vai nos ajudar a resistir e continuar aí adiante, apesar de tudo. Queria muito agradecer a tua presença, mas eu não vou deixar você ir embora sem uma última pergunta. Por que Orfeu olhou para trás, Robert? Por que você acha que Orfeu olhou para trás?
That is a great question. I love Orpheus. I love the myth of Orpheus. He had to look behind, because every mythic tale, there's always a point where the very thing that the gods say don't do, you know that it has to be done, because that's the moment of transformation. And so when Orpheus goes to the underworld, his intention is to bring his beloved Eurydice back to life. And the gods know, Orpheus, you have no idea who Eurydice is, if I say it boldly. And you can't bring her back, but go and try. And then he's going away, and they say, but don't turn around, because the work has to be spoiled. Why? Because if you read Rilke's poem, Orpheus, Hermes, Eurydice, it's in her being in the underworld that Orpheus is transformed. And it's her being in the underworld as the feminine that we are being taught in the myth to learn to see in dark light and the value from the point of view of death. That's what I think is one of the reasons why he must turn around. Backward glance. But what a perfect way to end. Orpheus is so important. I love him. So, thank you. Thanks very much.
Eu que te agradeço. Foi uma enorme alegria te receber. Muito obrigado, Robert.
Thank you all. My pleasure too. And I wish you all well. We all are living in difficult times, so stay safe. And we all are doing good work, so let's continue with that. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Até a próxima. Pessoal, momento histórico, hein? Oportunidade de assistir o Robert, de testemunhar uma pessoa da idade dele, dizendo coisas tão importantes, tão fundamentais, e realmente um estímulo de vida. Vamos resistir, fazer poesia e vamos adiante. Tá bom? Até o próximo encontro do Tiaços. Sexta-feira que vem com a Ginete Paris, tá? Até lá. Obrigado, Isa. Beijo enorme.
Obrigado, Marcos.
Tchau, tchau.
Obrigado, Isa.